Literary studies, like no other discipline, is faced with the challenge of defining its own object. What is a literary text? We know that in some, the whole is greater than its parts, greater than mere blots of ink on the page. They represent or do or mean something, and what that something is the sum of literary criticism itself. And this is brought into important conflict in conversation in Louis Armand's essay From Hypertext to Vortext, Notes on Materiality and Language, which can be found in this really wonderful essay collection, Joyce Media, on James Joyce, hypermedia, and textual genetics. And in this essay, Armand is looking at genetic criticism as a field of study in order to figure out what is the relationship between the materiality of the text and the virtual nature of the text, of this object that we talk about in literary criticism and try to come to definite statements about. And he connects this to Joyce's work in Finnegans Wake in general, which is hypercritical of this notion of identity and meaning and textuality and completeness in a properly post-structuralist manner. And Armand brings in all of the post-structuralist lingo from Derrida to, all sorts of other figures to keep in mind for thinking about what is it that we look at and struggle with in literary criticism. And I think this is a really important text for understanding some of the points of how do we come to some finality of what a text means, and also how does the notion of textuality itself mean that that notion of finality is always preliminary and always meant to spiral further and further in a hermeneutic spiral. Opening up, Armand presents a long quote from Derrida, two parts of which I want to really focus on. Derrida writes, firstly, the instant is always divided at its very point, at the point of its writing. This is an important property of language and signification for Lacan and Derrida together, which is this concept of différence. That signification, the meaning of a signifier, the ability to attach it concretely to a signified, make meaning and identity out of it, is always deferred to another signifier. That there is no absolute ground to justify the association between signifier and signified that we have, that it is in part an arbitrary process. Secondly, Derrida writes, as soon as the sentence is repeatable, that is, from its origin, the instant it is pronounced and becomes intelligible, thus idealizable, it is already instrumentalizable and affected by technology and virtuality. And this is important to how we understand a literary text, because literary texts depend upon the idea of repeating and presenting ideas visually on the page, semantically in terms of the relationship of the semantic units, and the notion of hermeneutically, how this is related in the process of creating meaning. And all this means that language naturally must defer itself to its reader. It must procure and prefer itself as an object of analysis to the reader. Thus, there is bound to be a separation, a bar between signifier and signified, which Lacan shows is really important for the way that we view signification. And Armand says that one of the important aspects of hypertextuality, which we see thematized in Finnegans Wake, and the definition of which he's going to develop as we go through this essay, is the notion of infrastructurality. That it is in part different domains communicating in very complex ways, such as the difference between writer and reader, between text and the reader who interprets the text, and this notion of interrelation between different structures, which need not have necessary a priori relations to one another, is the very grounds upon which we can have our literary project. And of course, we have an idea of a common textuality when we come into looking at a text. That I can hold up some text, whatever it may be, and we can have some common notion of this material thing that we're looking at, and we're coming up with different interpretations of it. That there is some sense of the objectivity of the materiality of the text. And what genetic criticism tries to do is it brings the genealogical method into confluence with the idea of coming up with a systematic study of manuscripts. So take Naked Lunch, for example. Genetic criticism would look at the iterations of the manuscripts that went before the published text of Naked Lunch in order to genealogically understand the development of Naked Lunch as a text, as a self-sufficient entity that can be bound and that can be talked about by different observers. So genetic criticism is not trying to find some sort of proof text or some sort of final text, but rather it is understanding the development of the idea of textuality and the idea of the implied intention behind each iteration of the text, about the way that the notion of authorial intention and the author itself is a developing processual idea that takes place in time. He says that genetic criticism is in part about direct treatment of the avant text, about the way that the text moves as an entity which requires mediation between the writer and that which is being written. And that textual genetics begins with a necessary, if apparently contradictory, assumption of incompletion. That any manuscript is itself incomplete because it's part of a larger process of development. And thus the genetic critic's insistence that we need not just look at the final text, whatever it may be, but we need to look at its development as not itself self-sufficient, and that by looking at this, we realize a key part of hermeneutics is the incompletion of any interpretation. That this is part of the idea of textuality itself, is that in order to be talked about as a text, it needs to be one of many texts. An indefinite article of a text, right? Not the text, but one text among many possible texts. And he says that what is significant is not that this indeterminacy arises as a consequence of the incompletion of genetics or from any other limitation of empirical knowledge, but that it is structural and structurally inherent. That in the idea of the text itself and of its presentation is that it is not the only option. That it itself is a process of certain questions of indeterminacy and of randomness and arbitration that goes behind the creation of any text. Thus, we are faced with the paradigmatic nature of any reading and interpretation. Think of reading in the dual sense of literally the act of reading something and a reading of a text, as in an interpretation. Thus, Armand states that in order to begin reading Finnegans Wake, we are first of all obliged to make certain assumptions of translation. That we are, in fact, to translate the apparent marks on the page into some determinate semiolinguistic system or language. That we must literally read in or into a lapsus of language, or no language, or as Joyce says, not language in any sense of the word. So that we might indeed say there is no language in Finnegans Wake. This is coming from Fritz Zen, who said this at a conference in Trieste. And I think this is really interesting because this idea of the coherence of language is challenged itself in Finnegans Wake, such that, as Armand puts it, the problem is that this correspondence of linking the marks on the page to a particular system cannot be generalized or indeed schematized according to any conventional notion of language, and that it arises in the first place out of the fact of this no language. Thus, the nothingness or the gaps of no language, of the incompleteness of any system which he has just been discussing, is the very ground upon which we can interpret a text in the first place, assign language to a particular system. And if we look at the way that this assigning has historically been done, we look at various correspondences or reader's guides or lexicons, such as a German or a French or an Irish lexicon to Finnegans Wake. All of these are trying to assume, as Armand puts it, a decipherment of the text. That Finnegans Wake is in fact a type of textual object to be deciphered, dissected, anatomized, classified, and so on. But Armand is not too privy to this. He says that the problem is that they're treating Finnegans Wake as if in and of themselves each of these facts is verifiable in an empirical sense, to a certain degree, and yet no idea of Finnegans Wake is verifiable, properly in the sense of a priori linking of signifier to signified, of textual materiality to the meaning we associate with it. It is because the idea is already a schematization, the outcome of a set of predictions centered upon a causal arrangement of symbolic correspondences, whose actual coordinate object has effectively been suppressed because, we may assume, it renders the very notion of verifiability nonsensical, and that it does so by exposing all presuppositions about language to the broadest implications of semiolinguistic materiality and to the radically probabilistic organization of language as a whole. So the problem with the way that a lot of genetic critics try to approach the text and the idea of meaning that Armand really wants to criticize here is that it supposes that we can grow closer and closer asymptotically to some notion of the truth of the text by just contextualizing the text. Literally contextualizing as linking multiple texts, iterations of the text together. But, in fact, and this is a point of Deleuze's, we can tabulate a list of facts all we want empirically. But the hermeneutic register, the virtual register, is still ontologically distinct from the material register. The affective and hermeneutic stands ontologically distinct from the facts which are the necessary condition for establishing any of these meanings or feelings or affects, right? In order for me to be able to have an interpretation, there has to be the objective fact of the material marks on the page. And those are the necessary conditions for having that interpretation. But there is no a priori distinction between these particular marks on the page and this particular interpretation that we come to have. Thus, there is an essential ambiguity and indeterminacy behind this notion of coming closer to or further away from a proper interpretation. It assumes a God's eye point of view that we can come outside of the text and look upon what is more or less grounded. But a la Baudrillard, we know that the text can be properly seen as floating through a crystalline medium, that it need not have some objective ground, but that we can understand its development through an understanding of the internal relationship of its elements. And of course, this requires some notion of reality, but reality is merely the necessary precondition for the virtuality of the text, which is the real object of the literary critic. And we need these empirical facts about the way that the text has developed in order to come to some preliminary notion of textuality. But Finnegans Wake itself brings this idea of textuality, of some concrete final notion of what the text even is. What is its structure? What is its narrative? Who are the characters? These very central ontological questions are unfinalizable in Finnegans Wake. As he says, that to verify already entails symbolization. In other words, to come to some notion that we have verified our interpretation, made it correct by linking it to the materiality of the text, itself begs the question of why we ought necessarily to link this symbolization, this theoretical construction of what the text is, to that particular materiality. He says we might say, therefore, that language proceeds on the basis of what we might call an inequality theorem, and that inequality itself provides the measure of verifiability. It may be that language occurs as such in the suspension of verifiability. This is a really interesting idea. Very similar to what Lacan is saying about the notion of subjectivity, that the very possibility of having this concept of myself is predicated upon the bar between my internal conception of selfhood and the selfhood that I get reflected back to me through the recognition I get from others, which entails that I speak and I act in ways which externalize my selfhood, and through this mediation between how I feel and how I project myself, and am then seen as myself by the image I get from others, entails this bar central to the notion of signification, this gap or this inequality that is the precondition of this notion of identity, but itself always defers this notion of identity into the future. This is what Armand is trying to say here. That there is a fundamental ontological difference between the material that is this text that I can point to, which can be a list of empirical facts, and the meaning of the text, which is ontologically distinct. This is very similar to the material-affect distinction that Deleuze and Guattari raised that I've talked about very detailedly in a lecture, in which they mention that there is a distinction, and this is quite farcical but true nonetheless, between breasts and the feeling of what it is like to have breasts. That on the one hand, you have the material list of facts, and on the other hand, you have the meaning or affects associated with them, which are fundamentally different. This leads Armand to understand the material indifference of semiolinguistic fragments to the constraints of context, reminds us that in fact there is nothing purposeful about language. In other words, it doesn't presuppose some coherent sense of complete purpose in order to be meaningful. Oftentimes we utter or say things or write things without having a clear sense of what the purpose was for writing them, and yet nevertheless they can be meaningful. And dreams are the perfect example of this. There need not be supposed that I have some true fundamental desire as the precondition for the kinds of dreams I have. The very possibility of having dreams of any kind, in fact, is my unconscious's way of dealing with its own alterity, of its own incompleteness and insurety. That language, he continues, harbors no secret design or intent, that it is not a subject replete with its own psychology or psychological agency. At the same time, to speak of language as such, as of an entity, is to distort the fact of what we might call its incompleteness, because we're talking about it as an entity. We might say, indeed, that language can only be defined against completion, if not against its possibility, and that it is this incompletion or condition of possibility which lends a semantic complexion to these material fragments. Without such a possibility as this, it would be impossible to read Finnegans Wake, or indeed to read at all. Thus, this notion of incompleteness, and this is what Deleuze and Guattari are going to run with when they talk about desire, is that Lacan is going to say that this symbol symbolizes a fundamental lack in the subject. Its inability to become what it desires, that it's always chasing its desire, which manifests as an incompletion, which Lacan considers as an existential lack. But Deleuze and Guattari don't see it like this at all. They see this gap central to our notion of subjectivity, which is our incompleteness, as a positive condition for creation, for reading, for interpretation, for desiring as an act. That the act of reading as something transformative depends upon this notion of a gap that is not a nothingness, but is itself productive. It has a momentum. It makes us forcibly live into the future, into the indeterminacy of the text. Armand says that structurally, at least, reading does not begin with a saturable and constraining context. He's quoting someone who he quoted before. but rather with the possibility of bringing otherwise disparate, non-contiguous elements into correspondence. That significance operates in the possibility of both affecting and arbitrating a semantic gap. Right? This notion of filling in gaps is the very possibility by which we can have a multiplicity of interpretations. That there is something incomplete by which the text produces its own alterity. This is how we can concretely ground fundamentally different interpretations in the same text. This is the multiplicity of the text so central to Derrida's conception of the text. And thus we have the idea of a hypertext, a textuality that is self-reflexively aware of its multiplicity, and as Armand says, the hyper prefix is taken here to refer not to a meta level of textuality, as in like escaping the text, a form of semantic epiphenomenon, but to an internal mechanism of semantic entanglement or linkage by which any textual element could be brought into communication with any other. And he speaks of this as becoming properly rhizomatic. That any particle of information, for example, could conceivably be linked to any other as in a computer according to the minimal existing unit of a pixel. This is very similar to the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about individual units as being selected by some symbolic scheme, by some regime of signs, as they put it, which then coherentizes, makes coherent these elements, not from the precondition of an a priori saturable and constraining context, but rather from the multiplicity of context, from the conjugation of multiple texts between each other, with no a priori conditions for which is the best text or the most true text. And this itself, this proliferation of the text from the past through into the future, is the very condition of our ability to come to some interpretation. Thus, there is non-locality and entanglement as central properties of the text. He says that Joyce's writing exacerbates the question of materiality by reaching constantly beyond the assumed limits of signifying probability, and by situating the nexus of semiolinguistic structure in its materiality and not in some form of anima or agency deposited in it. In other words, that we don't need to presuppose that Joyce had some coherent notion of the text in order to look at this particular text. We can view it in its radical contingency and still make meaning out of it, conceived of as a positive reader response project. What hypertext shows us, he says, is that semiolinguistic materiality, taken by itself as an empirical fact, is equally as meaningless as the generalization of the text from either a phenomenal or ideological point of view. Signification arises alone upon the possibility of a network of transverse relations, of these different domains that communicate between each other within the text, of different characters, of different idioms of speech, of different chapters and sections and whatnot. Non-local communication between material elements or particles which themselves define anterior transverse relations. Each particle is a set of coordinates in n dimensions, an indeterminate amount of dimensions. There is some sense of multiplicity, of there being multiple elements in the text, but there's no concrete number of their blank amount of characters in Finnegans Wake, or there are blank distinct chapters, because even though there are written distinct chapters, we know from genetic criticism that many of these were written as if they were conjoined together, and Joyce later split them in an act that shows the arbitrary notion of splitting a text into a certain amount of chapters. A variant point of articulation, which is at variance with itself, while at the same time producing an effect of structural contiguity. That the very notion of a text that coheres together depends upon it being different from itself. And I think this is a really interesting idea, this idea of a hypertext, which I think is really helpful for looking at how we read Finnegans Wake. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd like to donate to the channel, because I really appreciate it. It helps me get awesome books like this to hopefully share to you in a helpful way, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.